A millionaire with only 24 hours to live bought an elderly woman who was being sold by her own son and gave her shelter. The next day, when the millionaire was about to die without having anyone to leave his fortune to, what the elderly woman was capable of doing left him frozen. The medical office was immersed in a heavy silence, only broken by the rhythmic sound of the clock on the wall. Alexander Harrison, a 62-year-old man with perfectly combed grey hair and brown eyes that once shone with ambition, now stared at Dr. Richardson with an expression of disbelief. His hands, always steady in business, trembled slightly as he held the medical tests he had just received. The doctor, a middle-aged man with also grey hair and the tired expression of someone who has delivered many difficult news, took a deep breath before repeating the words that would forever change Alexander's life. "Mr. Alexander, as I said, your heart condition has deteriorated beyond what any treatment can reverse. Based on the analysis of your tests and your history, I fear you have at most 24 hours to live." The word death echoed in Alexander's mind like a funeral bell, but he tried to maintain the composure that had always characterized him in the most difficult business moments. His fortune, built over decades of tireless work, now seemed insignificant in the face of the cruel reality he was facing. He had spent his entire life accumulating wealth, building a business empire, but he had never allowed himself to form true bonds with other people. Now, at 62, he realized that he would die as he had lived in recent years, completely alone. The doctor continued explaining technical details about his condition, but Alexander could barely process the information, lost in thoughts about the emptiness his life had become. "Doctor, is there really any possibility of an error in the diagnosis? I need to be absolutely certain of what you're telling me." Dr. Richardson slowly shook his head, his eyes showing the compassion of someone who had witnessed many farewells. He had known Alexander for a few years, always treating him for the same heart condition that now reached its final stage. The doctor knew that Alexander was a lonely man, who never mentioned family or close friends during consultations, and this made the situation even sadder. Throughout all these years of treatment, Alexander always arrived alone to appointments and left the same way, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Now, seeing the impact of his words on the patient's face, the doctor felt the weight of responsibility in delivering such a definitive news. "Mr. Alexander, I've reviewed the tests 3 times with other specialists. Your heart failure is in an irreversible state. I deeply regret this, but I cannot offer false hopes when medicine has reached its limit." Alexander rose from the chair mechanically, as if his movements were controlled by an external force. His mind still struggled to accept the reality that had just been presented, but his body already seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He had always been a man of action, accustomed to solving problems with determination and financial resources, but now faced something that all the money in the world could not buy: more time to live. The medical office, with its white walls and framed diplomas, seemed to suffocate Alexander as he tried to process the implications of the diagnosis. His business, his investments, his luxurious mansion, all of this would lose meaning in a matter of hours. "Doctor, I need to leave now. Thank you for your honesty, even if it is devastating." The city streets seemed different to Alexander's eyes as he walked with no apparent destination, leaving the medical office. Each person passing by him was living their normal life, unaware that a condemned man walked among them. Alexander observed families, couples, children playing, and for the first time in years, felt a deep envy for those human connections he had never cultivated. His life had been an endless sequence of business meetings, signed contracts, and business decisions, but he had completely neglected the human part of his existence. Now, with only 24 hours left, he realized he had no one to call, no one to embrace, no one who would miss him when he was gone. The irony was bitter. The richest man in the region would die as the poorest in terms of human relationships. How could I waste so much time building wealth and forgetting to build a family? Lost in his dark thoughts, Alexander ended up walking to the main square of the city, a place he normally avoided as it was frequented by people of lower social classes. Today, however, his steps had brought him there without him consciously realizing it. The square was bustling with street vendors, families having picnics, and children running between the trees. It was a stark contrast to the world of offices and meetings in which Alexander lived, a cruel reminder of all the simple and authentic life he had lost over the years. He sat on a bench trying to organize his thoughts and decide how he would spend his last hours of life. Would it be better to return to his empty mansion and wait for the end alone, or should he try to do something meaningful with the time he had left? What's the point of having all this money if I can't buy even one more day of life? It was then that his eyes fixed on a scene that left him perplexed and disturbed. Across the square, a man of about 40 with black hair and cold eyes was arguing loudly with an elderly lady. The woman, who appeared to be around 70 years old, had grey hair tied in a simple braid and wore humble but clean clothes. Alexander noticed that she was holding a small old suitcase and seemed to be crying, while the man gestured aggressively. Even from a distance, it was possible to see that it was a serious discussion, and something about the man's behavior deeply troubled Alexander. The lady tried to speak, but the man constantly interrupted her, pointing his finger at her with evident irritation. "Mother, you don't understand that I can't support you anymore. I don't have the financial means to take care of someone your age." The man, whom Alexander would later learn was called Stephen, continued his increasingly aggressive discussion with the elderly woman. Rosemary, the lady who was being confronted, discreetly wiped away her tears while trying to reason with her son. She had dedicated her entire life to caring for her family, working in family homes to support Stephen when he was a child, always putting his needs above her own. Now in old age, when she needed care and affection, she was being treated as an unwanted burden. Her hands trembled not just from age, but from the emotional pain of hearing such cruel words from the son she loved unconditionally. The humiliation was even greater because it was happening in public, where strangers could witness her degradation. "Son, I worked my whole life to give you everything you needed. I can't understand how we got to this point." Stephen, impatient with what he considered unnecessary sentimentality from his mother, decided to take a drastic action. He had been thinking about this solution for weeks, seeing it as the only way to rid himself of what he considered a financial and emotional burden. His greed and selfishness had grown over the years, fueled by frustration at not having achieved the financial success he desired. In his distorted mind, Rosemary represented only medical expenses, food and care that he was not willing to bear. The idea of selling her to someone who could take care of her seemed to him a practical and even beneficial solution. He began to speak louder, attracting the attention of other people in the square, not caring about the humiliation he was causing his own mother. "Listen carefully, Mother. I found someone who is willing to take care of you in exchange for a sum of money. It's the best solution for all of us." Rosemary was in a state of shock upon hearing Stephen's words, hardly able to believe that her own son was proposing to sell her as if she were an object. During 70 years of life, she had faced many difficulties, worked in harsh conditions and made enormous sacrifices, but she had never been treated so inhumanely. Her legs weakened, and she had to lean on a nearby post to avoid falling. The pain in her chest was not physical, but emotional, a deep wound caused by the betrayal of the one who should protect and love her. She tried to find words to express her indignation and sadness, but the emotion was so intense that she could barely form complete sentences. Other people in the square began to stop and observe the scene, some with expressions of curiosity, others of discomfort. "Stephen, how can you talk like that? I'm your mother, not an animal to be sold." The cruel son continued his argument, completely ignoring his mother's feelings and the unwanted attention he was attracting. For him, Rosemary had become an obstacle in his pursuit of a more comfortable life, and he felt no remorse for his actions. Stephen had completely lost his sense of family and human values, blinded by ambition and selfishness. He knew he had found a potential buyer for his mother, someone who needed domestic care and was willing to pay for it. In his distorted mind, he was doing a favor for both Rosemary and himself, solving two problems at once. The crowd forming around the argument didn't seem to bother him. On the contrary, he felt that public pressure could help convince his mother to accept the situation. "Mom, stop being dramatic. This is business, a transaction that will benefit everyone. You'll have a place to live and I'll have peace." Alexander, observing the entire scene from a distance, felt a mixture of horror and indignation growing in his chest. Even though he was a man who had distanced himself from human relationships, he still maintained a basic sense of decency and morality. The idea of a son selling his own mother was something that exceeded all limits of acceptable behavior. He thought about his own situation. He would die alone because he had never cultivated family relationships, while that lady was being abandoned precisely by the one who should take care of her. The irony of the situation didn't go unnoticed by Alexander, who began to rise from the bench where he was sitting. His terminal condition had given him a different perspective on the value of life and human relationships, and he couldn't simply ignore what he was witnessing. "I can't believe I'm watching a son treat his mother like merchandise. This is simply unacceptable." Rosemary continued trying to argue with Stephen, her tears flowing freely while she begged him to reconsider his decision. She had raised that man with love and dedication, working long hours to ensure he had an education and opportunities in life. Now, seeing the result of all her efforts and sacrifices, she felt she had failed as a mother. In her mind, she questioned where she had gone wrong in raising Stephen, what values she had failed to teach for him to become such a cruel and selfish person. The public humiliation made everything even more painful, as Rosemary had always been a dignified and respectful woman, and now she was being exposed in a degrading way in front of strangers. She held her small suitcase tightly, as if it were the only thing left for her in the world. "Stephen, I beg you, think about what you're doing. I'm the woman who brought you into this world and cared for you throughout your childhood." Stephen, impatient with his mother's pleas, decided to accelerate the negotiation process he had planned. He had arranged a meeting in the square with a person who had shown interest in hiring someone for domestic services and care, and he didn't want to miss the opportunity to close the deal. His emotional coldness was evident as he spoke about Rosemary as if she were an object to be negotiated, without any consideration for her feelings or dignity. The crowd that had formed around the argument included people of different ages and social classes, some clearly disturbed by what they were witnessing. Some people whispered among themselves, others shook their heads in disapproval, but no one had the courage to directly intervene in the situation. Stephen seemed to feed on the attention, feeling he was in control of the situation. "Mom, the person who's going to take care of you is arriving. You should be grateful I found a solution to your problem." The situation became even more tense when Stephen began to describe the terms of the sale he had negotiated, talking about Rosemary as if she were his property to be transferred. He mentioned monetary values, working conditions, and expectations, all in front of his own mother, who listened to every word with increasing horror. Rosemary felt as if she were living a nightmare, unable to believe that her own child was willing to go so far in his cruelty. She tried once more to appeal to any trace of humanity that might exist in Stephen, reminding him of happy childhood moments, of the sacrifices she had made for him, of the unconditional love she had always offered him. But her words seemed to have no effect on the hardened son, who saw only numbers and convenience in the whole situation. "Stephen, remember when you were little and I worked 2 jobs to buy your school supplies? How could you have forgotten all the love I've always dedicated to you?" Alexander could no longer remain passive in the face of what he was witnessing. His own imminent mortality had given him clarity about what really matters in life, and seeing an elderly woman being treated so inhumanely awakened in him an indignation he hadn't felt in years. He began walking toward the group, his imposing presence drawing attention even amid the crowd. His fine clothes and elegant bearing contrasted with the square's environment, but he didn't care about social differences at that moment. Everything he saw was a glaring injustice that needed to be confronted. With each step he took toward Stephen and Rosemary, Alexander felt a growing determination, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if in his final hours of life, he had finally found something truly important to do. "If I'm going to die in 24 hours, at least I can try to do one right thing before I go." The final confrontation of the scene was about to happen when Alexander finally got close enough to clearly hear the cruel words that Stephen was directing at his mother. The millionaire observed Rosemary closely and saw a woman who, despite her age and degrading situation, maintained a natural dignity in her kind eyes. There was something in her posture, even amid humiliation, that demonstrated an inner strength built over decades of honest work and sacrifice. Alexander also analyzed Stephen, immediately noticing the coldness in his eyes and the complete absence of any trace of filial love or human compassion. The difference between mother and son was striking. While Rosemary radiated kindness even in her suffering, Stephen emanated a calculated cruelty that left Alexander deeply disturbed. How is it possible that such an obviously good woman raised such a despicable son? The tension in the square reached its peak when Stephen finally spotted Alexander approaching and realized that his elegant and clearly wealthy presence could represent an even better business opportunity than he had planned. His greedy eyes gleamed as he assessed the expensive clothes and distinguished bearing of the millionaire, and he immediately began to reformulate his sales strategy. Rosemary, in turn, noticed the stranger's approach with a mixture of hope and fear, not knowing if this new presence would make her situation better or worse. The crowd around also sensed that something significant was about to happen, and the murmur of conversations diminished as everyone waited for the next developments. Alexander stopped a few meters away, his eyes fixed on Stephen, with an expression that mixed disbelief and indignation. "Sir, from what I understand, you are trying to sell your own mother as if she were some ordinary object?" The tense silence that formed in the square after Alexander's direct question was broken by Stephen's sarcastic laugh, who quickly assessed the elegant appearance of the man before him and saw an even better opportunity for profit. His greedy eyes scanned the fine suit, expensive watch and confident posture of Alexander, mentally calculating how much he could charge someone who clearly possessed abundant financial resources. Rosemary observed the interaction with a racing heart, not knowing if this stranger represented salvation or just another form of humiliation. The crowd around seemed to hold their breath, feeling that something important was about to happen, while Stephen straightened his shoulders and adopted a tone of voice that tried to sound professional and justifying. "Sir, I see you are a person of good taste and resources. My mother is a hard-working woman, experienced in domestic services, and I'm looking for someone who can offer her a suitable home. This is not a sale, but rather a mutually beneficial arrangement where she will provide services in exchange for care." Alexander felt a wave of disgust and indignation upon hearing Stephen try to disguise his cruelty with smooth words and elaborate justifications. The man's hypocrisy was glaring, and Alexander, who had spent decades dealing with dishonest people in the business world, immediately recognized the manipulation behind the seemingly reasonable speech. He looked directly into Rosemary's eyes and saw there a mixture of shame, fear, and wounded dignity that deeply touched his heart. At that moment, Alexander made a decision that surprised even himself, moved by a combination of moral indignation and perhaps the proximity of his own death, which had given him a different perspective on what really mattered in life. His voice came out firm and loaded with authority, cutting through Stephen's pathetic excuses like a sharp blade. "Stop this disgusting charade. What you are doing is selling your own mother, and that is something no decent person should accept or tolerate." The direct confrontation left Stephen momentarily disconcerted, but his greed quickly overcame any embarrassment he might feel. He had invested a lot of time and energy in finding a solution to what he considered his mother's problem, and he wasn't willing to give up easily, especially when a potential buyer with obviously superior resources had appeared. Rosemary, in turn, felt a mixture of hope and terror, fearing that this stranger's intervention could result in an even worse situation for her. Her hands trembled as she held her small suitcase, and she tried to decipher the intentions of the elegant man who had placed himself between her and her cruel son. Stephen quickly regained his composure and decided to appeal directly to the business instincts that he assumed Alexander possessed. "Sir, I see that you are an experienced businessman, so you certainly understand that sometimes we need to make practical decisions. My mother needs care that I cannot offer, and you clearly have the resources to provide her with a comfortable life." Alexander stepped forward, his imposing presence making Stephen instinctively back away, while his voice carried decades of business authority mixed with genuine moral indignation. He had made many difficult decisions in his business life, but he had never witnessed something as morally repugnant as a son trying to profit from his own mother's suffering. The crowd around began to whisper among themselves, clearly divided between those who supported Alexander's intervention and others who preferred not to get involved in the situation. Rosemary observed every movement and every word exchanged between the two men, feeling as if her fate was being decided by forces completely outside her control. Alexander fixed his dark brown eyes directly on Stephen's cold eyes, his voice low, but carrying an implicit threat that made it clear he would not tolerate any more games or manipulations. "Young man, I'm going to make you a very simple proposal. Tell me exactly how much you were expecting to receive for this disgusting transaction, and I will pay that amount right now. But after that, you will leave your mother's life forever, because you don't deserve to even be in the presence of a woman who clearly is worth much more than you will ever be worth." Alexander's unexpected offer left Stephen in a momentary state of shock, followed by a greedy excitement that he tried to disguise under a mask of careful consideration. Rosemary felt as if the ground was moving beneath her feet, unable to fully process what was happening, but beginning to feel a small spark of hope that perhaps her situation might improve. The crowd around had grown considerably, with people stopping their activities to witness the drama unfolding in the square, some commenting in low voices about the strangeness of the situation. Stephen quickly calculated in his mind how much he could ask for, knowing that he had found someone with resources far superior to the original buyer he had planned to meet. His eyes sparkled with the possibility of obtaining much more money than he had initially imagined, and he decided to risk a value that he considered substantial. "Sir, considering that my mother is an experienced and reliable worker, and taking into account the care and responsibility involved, I believe that 5,000 would be a fair value for this transfer of responsibility." Alexander didn't hesitate for even a second before taking out his Italian leather wallet and counting the notes with the same ease with which he signed million-dollar contracts in his office. For a man of his wealth, 5,000 was an insignificant amount, less than he spent on a single meal in exclusive restaurants, but he knew that for Stephen, it represented a fortune that would validate his cruel decision. Rosemary observed the transaction with a mixture of horror and relief, still struggling to accept that she was literally being bought and sold like an object, but at the same time feeling that perhaps her situation could improve in the hands of this stranger, compared to the cruelty of her own son. The people around the square watched in respectful silence, many of them clearly disturbed by the nature of the transaction, but recognizing that Alexander's intervention represented an improvement in the elderly woman's circumstances. Alexander extended the money to Stephen with an expression of absolute disgust, his voice loaded with contempt and an implicit promise of severe consequences if there was any attempt to go back. "Here's the money you asked for, and now I want you to disappear from this woman's life forever. If I find out that you have bothered her again, or tried to extort more money from her or me, you will discover that I have resources and connections that can make your life very uncomfortable." Stephen took the money with trembling hands, his greed temporarily overcoming any remorse he might feel, but Alexander's veiled threat clearly left him nervous. He quickly counted the notes, confirming that the amount was complete, and then looked at Rosemary one last time, with an expression that mixed relief and what might have been momentary regret. Rosemary stared at her son with tears in her eyes, still hoping he would change his mind and show some trace of the love she had nurtured for him throughout his life. The silent farewell between mother and son was loaded with decades of history, sacrifice, and unrequited love, a moment that marked the definitive end of a relationship that should have been sacred. Stephen put the money in his pocket and took a few steps back, clearly anxious to leave the situation before he could change his mind or face more moral judgments from the crowd. "Mother, this is better for all of us. The gentleman here can give you a life I could never offer. I hope you'll be happy and understand that I did this because I had no other choice." After Stephen quickly disappeared into the crowd, taking with him any chance of reconciliation, Alexander turned to Rosemary with a much softer and more respectful expression. The transformation in his posture and tone of voice was immediate and notable, shifting from the threatening authority he had used against Stephen to a genuine gentleness that surprised the elderly woman. Rosemary was visibly in shock, still processing how quickly her life had completely changed, and looked at Alexander with a mixture of gratitude, fear, and confusion about what would happen next. The crowd around began to slowly disperse, satisfied to have witnessed an apparently positive resolution to a terrible situation, although many continued looking over their shoulders as they moved away. Alexander noticed that Rosemary was trembling, not just from the cold or age, but from the emotional trauma of the entire experience, and decided he needed to act quickly to help her recover. "Ma'am, my name is Alexander, and I want you to know that I will never treat you as an object or property. What just happened was necessary to get you out of a terrible situation, but now I would like to offer you a dignified and respectful home. We can go to my house, where you can rest and decide what you want to do with your life." The journey from the square to Alexander's mansion was made in contemplative silence, with Rosemary sitting on the soft leather seat of the luxury car, still trying to process the surreal sequence of events that had transformed her life in a matter of minutes. She watched the familiar city streets passing by through the window, knowing she was leaving behind not only her previous life, but also any hope of reconciliation with the son she had raised with so much love and sacrifice. Alexander drove carefully, occasionally looking in the rearview mirror to check how Rosemary was coping with the situation and reflecting on his own impulsive decision to intervene in a situation that wasn't technically his business. Alexander's mansion was in an exclusive area of the city, surrounded by well-maintained gardens and imposing architecture that spoke of decades of business success and wealth accumulation. When they arrived at the electronic gate, Rosemary looked at the property with a mixture of admiration and intimidation, never having imagined that one day she would be entering such a luxurious place as a guest and not as an employee. "Alexander, I need to confess that I'm very confused by all this. I can't understand why a stranger would do something so generous for a person like me." Inside the mansion, Rosemary was impressed by the elegance and luxury surrounding her, but also noticed the coldness and lack of human warmth in the environment. The furniture was expensive and well chosen, the artwork was clearly valuable, and every detail of the decorations screamed wealth and good taste, but something indefinable was missing that would make the place truly welcoming. Alexander led her to the main living room, where large windows offered a magnificent view of the gardens, and gestured for her to sit in a comfortable armchair while he himself took a seat in a nearby chair. The difference in social class between them was obvious in every aspect of their clothes, posture, and manner of speaking, but Alexander made a conscious effort to minimize this difference through his gentleness and respect. Rosemary observed every detail of the luxurious environment, but her main attention was focused on the man who had so drastically changed her life, trying to understand his true motivations and intentions. "This house is magnificent, Alexander, but I can sense that it's a very lonely place, all this beauty and wealth. But I feel something important is missing here." As the night progressed and both settled in the elegant living room, Alexander felt a growing need to be honest with Rosemary about his situation, beginning to share aspects of his life that he had never discussed with another person. He spoke about how he had built his business empire through decades of relentless work, sacrificing personal relationships and family connections in the name of financial success. Rosemary listened attentively, occasionally asking gentle questions that demonstrated her genuine concern for his emotional well-being, an attention that Alexander hadn't received in years. She shared her own life story, describing decades of hard work in family homes, always putting the needs of others before her own, raising Stephen as a single mother, and making enormous sacrifices to ensure he would have opportunities she never had. The conversation flowed naturally between them, creating an unexpected connection based on shared experiences of loneliness and sacrifice, albeit coming from completely different circumstances. "Rosemary, it's strange how two people from such different worlds can understand each other so well. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people, but I've never felt a genuine connection like the one I'm feeling now in our conversation." Rosemary, touched by the sincerity and vulnerability that Alexander was demonstrating, began to treat him with the kind of maternal affection and genuine care that he had never experienced, not even in his distant childhood. She noticed that he seemed tired and worried, and naturally began to offer the type of care and attention she had learned to give throughout decades of caring for others. Alexander felt moved by Rosemary's genuine attention, recognizing that it was the first time in years that someone cared about his personal well-being without having financial or professional motivations behind it. The irony of the situation did not go unnoticed by him. After a lifetime seeking success and wealth, he was finding the human warmth that had always been missing in his life through an elderly woman who had been abandoned by her own son. Rosemary prepared tea for both and insisted that Alexander eat properly, demonstrating the kind of instinctive care that had characterized her entire life, even in such unusual circumstances. "Alexander, I can see that you carry a very heavy weight on your shoulders. Sometimes a person needs someone who truly cares about their well-being, not their wealth or social position." As dawn approached and both had shared deep stories about their lives, Alexander felt that the time had come to reveal the truth about his terminal medical condition. The words came out with difficulty, laden with the weight of a reality that he was still struggling to accept. But he felt that Rosemary deserved to know the truth about the man who had interfered in her life so dramatically. He described the devastating diagnosis he had received just hours before, the irreversible heart failure that gave him at most 24 hours to live, and how this proximity to death had changed his perspective on what really mattered in life. Rosemary listened to the confession in silence, her tears beginning to flow again, but this time out of compassion for the man who had saved her from a humiliating situation. The revelation explained many things about Alexander's behavior, his impulsive decision to intervene in the square, and his sudden need to do something meaningful with the time he had left. "Rosemary, now you understand why I did what I did today. When a person knows they're going to die, certain things become very clear, and I couldn't stand by watching such a great injustice happen in front of me." The conversation took an even deeper turn when Alexander began to talk about his regrets and the loneliness that had characterized his life, especially his lack of family or heirs to whom he could leave his vast fortune. He described how he had spent decades accumulating wealth and building a business empire, but had completely neglected building meaningful relationships or creating an emotional legacy that could endure beyond his death. Rosemary listened with growing compassion, recognizing the cruel irony of his situation. While she had been rejected by the son she had raised with so much love, Alexander had never had the opportunity to experience the family bonds that she valued so much. She offered words of comfort and understanding, using her life experience to help Alexander process his regrets and fears about his imminent death. Her elderly hands, calloused from decades of hard work, gently touched Alexander's hands in a gesture of consolation that he found deeply comforting. "Alexander, a life is not measured only by what we accumulate, but also by the kindness we show and the lives we touch. What you did for me today shows that your heart is still full of compassion." The most revealing moment of the night came when Alexander, his voice choked with emotion, confessed that his greatest sadness was not the prospect of death itself, but the fact that he would die without leaving his fortune to someone who truly deserved it or could make good use of it. He spoke about how he had worked tirelessly to build his wealth, but now realized that all this effort would be wasted if there was no one to continue his legacy or use his resources to do good in the world. Rosemary absorbed every word with growing understanding, beginning to perceive the depth of loneliness and despair that Alexander had carried for years, masked by his appearance of success and power. The vulnerability he was demonstrating was something completely new to her, accustomed to being seen as the person who needed care, not as someone capable of offering meaningful emotional support to another person. The conversation had created an unexpected intimacy between them, based on mutual honesty and understanding of their respective pains and solitudes. "Alexander, it's a terrible tragedy that someone so generous and capable of doing good has lived so long without having someone to love and be loved in return. But perhaps it's not too late to find some purpose and peace in your final hours." As the first light of dawn began to filter through the elegant curtains of the mansion, Alexander made a final confession that would leave Rosemary deeply thoughtful and set the stage for the events that would follow. With a mixture of desperate hope and melancholic resignation, he admitted that his significant fortune would be left without purpose after his death, as he had no heirs, close family, or even intimate friends who could inherit and make good use of his accumulated wealth. He described how he had consulted lawyers about possibilities for charitable donations, but always felt uncomfortable with impersonal organizations that might waste his resources. Rosemary listened to this revelation with a mixture of surprise and growing concern, beginning to understand the magnitude of Alexander's loneliness and the complexity of his situation. She had never met someone with so many material resources, but so little in terms of meaningful human connections, and this made her reflect on the different forms that poverty and wealth can take in a person's life. Rosemary, in a few hours, everything I've built throughout my life will be left without purpose, with no one to continue doing the good that I would like to be done. It's a feeling of emptiness that haunts me more than death itself. When the morning sun began to shine through the large windows of the mansion, Rosemary had already been up for more than an hour, moving silently through the luxurious kitchen with a familiarity that surprised even herself. Her decades of experience caring for others had created instincts that worked independently of the environment, and she naturally began to prepare a nutritious breakfast for Alexander, using the high-quality ingredients she found in the well-stocked pantry. She had awakened before dawn, unable to sleep completely due to concern about Alexander's health condition, and decided to use the time to explore the kitchen and familiarize herself with the available utensils and ingredients. Rosemary noticed that Alexander had slept little and seemed paler than the night before, signs that her experience with sick people helped her immediately recognize as indicators that his condition was deteriorating more quickly than expected. As she prepared oatmeal with fresh fruits, lightly seasoned scrambled eggs and whole wheat toast, Rosemary reflected on this man's inexplicable generosity and felt a growing need to repay his kindness in the only way she knew how, through genuine care and loving attention that she had perfected over decades of serving other families. Alexander needs someone to take proper care of him in these final moments. I can do nothing about his illness, but I can ensure that he feels loved and cared for as every human being deserves, especially when facing their last days. Alexander woke up to the aroma of homemade food filling his mansion, an experience he hadn't lived in decades of solitary life, and meals prepared by distant employees who fulfilled their professional obligations without any personal touch or affection. When he went down to the kitchen, moving more slowly than usual due to the fatigue his heart condition was causing, he found Rosemary softly humming a gentle melody while organizing medications in small containers labeled with precise schedules, demonstrating an attention to detail that revealed her experience in caring for people with special health needs and complex medical conditions. The table was set with special care, including a small flower from the garden in a water glass as a centerpiece, artistically folded cloth napkins, and polished silverware shining under the morning light, a feminine and loving touch that his house had never known in all the decades of solitary existence. Rosemary greeted Alexander with a genuine and warm smile that illuminated the entire environment. Immediately noticing his increased paleness and the way he moved more carefully, signs that led her to gently insist that he sit down while she served the breakfast she had prepared, especially considering his specific nutritional needs and the restrictions his heart condition might impose. Alexander felt deeply touched by Rosemary's maternal attention, recognizing that he had never received this type of care, even as a child, raised by professional nannies who fulfilled their contractual obligations without showing true affection or personal interest in his emotional well-being. Rosemary, I can't remember the last time someone cared so much about me in such a genuine and selfless way. You have a natural gift for caring for people, something I never knew I was missing in my life until experiencing your care. During breakfast, which extended for more than an hour due to the relaxed pace that Rosemary naturally established, she carefully observed Alexander's eating habits and noticed that he ate very little, probably due to the combination of his medical condition affecting his appetite and years of solitary meals that had completely removed the pleasure of eating and transformed feeding into a mechanical necessity. She began to tell detailed stories of her life while gently encouraging him to eat more, describing the elaborate family meals she used to prepare when Stephen was a child, times when food was simple, but always shared with love, gratitude, and lively conversations that made each meal a family celebration. Rosemary talked about how she had learned to cook from her own mother, a wise woman who believed that preparing food with love was one of the purest forms of showing care and affection for another person, and how she had passed on these traditions and values to Stephen during his childhood, hoping that he would one day do the same with his own family. Alexander found himself eating more than he had eaten in weeks, stimulated not only by the exceptional quality of the food and the homemade flavors he hadn't experienced in a long time, but mainly by the warm company and loving attention that Rosemary demonstrated through each gesture and word. She naturally adjusted the consistency and seasonings of the food as she observed his reactions and preferences, showing an intuition developed through years of caring for people with different needs, limitations, and personal tastes, always adapting her care to maximize the comfort and satisfaction of those under her care. Alexander, a meal shared with good conversation feeds not only the body but also the soul and the heart. I can see that you're not used to this, but it's something every human being deserves to experience, especially during difficult times like the ones you're facing now. As the day progressed and morning slowly turned into afternoon, Catherine, the housekeeper who had faithfully worked in the mansion for more than 15 years and had witnessed many changes and events in Alexander's life, observed with growing fascination and genuine admiration the remarkable transformation that Rosemary was bringing not only to the physical atmosphere of the house, but mainly to the emotional state and behavior of her employer. Catherine had witnessed many people trying to approach Alexander over the years, always driven by transparent financial interests, blatant professional ambitions or curiosity about his wealth, and had developed a sharp and reliable instinct to detect falsehood, manipulation, and hidden intentions in people who tried to gain Alexander's trust or favor. However, observing Rosemary during hours of natural and spontaneous interaction, Catherine could not identify any trace of dishonesty, hidden interest, or calculated behavior, only a genuine and natural kindness that seemed to flow from the elderly woman like breathing, without effort or awareness of being observed and evaluated. Rosemary treated Catherine with the same profound respect and authentic kindness that she demonstrated toward Alexander, immediately recognizing her as an experienced colleague in household care and frequently asking for her valuable opinion on the specific preferences, established routines, and particular needs of Alexander that she had observed over the years. The housekeeper was genuinely impressed when Rosemary respectfully insisted on helping with daily household tasks, not because she felt obligated by her position or situation, but because she genuinely could not stand still and relax when she saw useful work to be done and people who could benefit from her help and experience. Catherine, in all these 15 years working here and observing Mr. Alexander, I have never seen him so relaxed, calm, and, I dare say, happy and at peace with himself. This lady has something very special, a natural and authentic kindness that simply cannot be feigned or imitated, no matter how much someone tries. During the afternoon, when the sun was stronger and pleasantly warmed the mansion's rooms through the large windows, Alexander felt physically more debilitated than he had experienced until then, with the characteristic fatigue of heart disease manifesting in progressively more intense waves that left him without enough energy for simple activities such as walking between. Rosemary immediately noticed his deteriorating condition through subtle signs that her experience had taught her to recognize, and without making any unnecessary fuss or showing panic that might alarm Alexander, she discreetly reorganized the environment around him to make it significantly more comfortable, strategically adjusting pillows to improve his posture, checking, and she carefully prepared specific herbal teas that she knew from practical experience and traditional knowledge passed down through generations, significantly helped with heart and circulatory problems, sharing valuable knowledge and natural methods she had acquired over decades of dedicated care for elderly, sick, and people with various medical conditions. Alexander, who throughout his adult life had been accustomed to hiding physical weaknesses and maintaining a facade of strength and control even when feeling most vulnerable and insecure, found himself completely relaxing and allowing Rosemary to care for him without any resistance, embarrassment, or attempt to keep up appearances. Her presence and attentive care brought a sense of profound peace and emotional security that he had never experienced before, a tranquility that allowed him to lower all the psychological defenses he had kept rigidly erected during decades of competitive business life and superficial relationships. Rosemary, it is extraordinary and almost inexplicable how your presence makes me feel safe and protected in a way that I have never experienced before in my entire life. It's as if, for the first time in decades, I could simply be human, vulnerable and authentic without any fear of being judged, criticized, or betrayed for showing weakness. As evening slowly approached, and Alexander rested comfortably in his favorite armchair in the library, surrounded by thousands of books he had collected over the years, but rarely had time to properly appreciate, Rosemary sat close to him with a knitting project she had started using wool she found in a cabinet, naturally creating an environment of cozy domestic companionship. She shared detailed and touching memories of her simple childhood, yet rich in family love, telling elaborate stories about her own mother and grandmother, extraordinarily strong women who had faced significant economic difficulties, social discrimination, and immense personal challenges, but always maintained unbreakable faith, kindness in their hearts, and determination to help. Rosemary described with vivid details how these remarkable women had found joy and deep satisfaction in the simple things of life: a healthy child, a shared meal, a neighbor helped, a prayer answered, small daily miracles that constituted the true wealth of their existence. Alexander listened to these stories with growing admiration and a sense of discovery, realizing that Rosemary came from a lineage of extraordinary women who had found true and lasting wealth in deep family relationships, selfless service to others, and solid spiritual values, something completely different and infinitely more valuable than the material wealth he had spent his entire. Through her simple yet profound stories, Rosemary naturally revealed fundamental values and life perspectives that made Alexander sincerely question many of the choices and priorities he had established throughout his career, not in a critical or judgmental way that would make him feel defensive, but through practical examples of a completely different way of living, finding meaning. Alexander, my grandmother, who was a very wise woman despite never having attended formal school, used to say that a person's true wealth is measured by the genuine love they can give and receive throughout life, not by the gold, properties, or power they can accumulate. It took me many decades of experience and reflection to fully understand the depth and truth of this simple yet transformative wisdom. As night gradually settled in, and Rosemary carefully prepared a light but highly nutritious dinner, selecting ingredients that she knew were beneficial for people with heart problems and adjusting seasonings to stimulate Alexander's reduced appetite, he found himself intensely struggling with conflicting thoughts about his unique situation and the extraordinary possibilities. The idea of leaving his considerable and carefully accumulated fortune to Rosemary had become a serious and increasingly attractive consideration, especially after repeatedly witnessing her genuine kindness, completely selfless care, and natural ability to bring peace and joy to his life. But decades of painful experiences with people who had systematically tried to manipulate. He had been cruelly betrayed by business partners he considered friends, deliberately deceived by supposed friends who turned out to be interested only in his resources, and emotionally manipulated by women who pretended love and affection to gain access to his wealth and social status. Traumatic experiences that had built almost impenetrable emotional walls that he now desperately. Rosemary, completely unaware of Alexander's intense thoughts and internal conflicts about inheritance, wills, and financial matters, continued to care for him with exactly the same loving dedication, meticulous attention, and genuine affection she would have shown if he were a dear long-time relative or an old family friend, never mentioning money, asking any questions about his. Her attention was totally and exclusively focused on his physical well-being, emotional comfort, and spiritual peace, demonstrating a purity of intention and material disinterest that Alexander had rarely encountered in his life, especially among people who knew of his wealth. How can I be absolutely certain that this extraordinary kindness is genuine, and not another elaborate performance orchestrated by someone exceptionally skilled in manipulation? But if it's real, if Rosemary is truly the good person she appears to be, how can I waste the unique opportunity to leave my fortune to someone who really deserves it and will make good use of it? During dinner, served in the formal dining room that was rarely used for intimate meals and that normally remained empty and silent, Rosemary completely transformed the austere and intimidating environment into a welcoming and warm space through small, carefully thought-out personal touches and her naturally warm presence that seemed to radiate peace and contentment. She had found elegant candles in the pantry and created soft, romantic lighting that made the meal more intimate, comfortable, and special, while her gentle, intelligent, and stimulating conversation filled the space that normally echoed only with the oppressive silence of Alexander's chronic loneliness. During the prolonged meal, she demonstrated genuine and respectful interest in learning more about Alexander's complex business affairs, professional achievements, and personal accomplishments, not with the calculating and transparently self-interested curiosity that he was accustomed to encountering in other people, but with the kind of caring, proud, and admiring interest that Alexander found himself sharing intimate details about his career, challenges overcome, and accomplishments achieved from a completely different and more personal perspective, focusing not just on the financial and material aspects that normally dominated his professional conversations, but on the deep personal satisfactions, moments of true fulfillment, and emotional and Rosemary listened to each word with respectful and concentrated attention, occasionally asking perceptive and intelligent questions that demonstrated her natural ability to understand complex business concepts and her sharp intuition about human motivations, despite her limited formal education and humble background that had not included exposure to the business world. It's absolutely wonderful and inspiring to see how you built all this through hard work, unbreakable determination, and clear vision, Alexander. You must feel a great justified pride when looking at everything you've accomplished with your own hands, intelligence, and perseverance throughout so many years of dedication. When the time came to prepare for sleep, a moment that Alexander traditionally faced with anxiety due to the loneliness and dark thoughts that night brought, Rosemary caringly insisted on meticulously checking all of Alexander's medications, organizing them by time and dosage, and making sure that he had absolutely everything he might need during the night, including fresh water. She carefully prepared a special calming tea, using a mixture of herbs that she knew from practical experience to help people with heart problems sleep better, relax tense muscles, and reduce the nighttime anxiety that frequently accompanied serious medical conditions, and arranged a comfortable chair in the hallway near Alexander's bedroom, strategically positioning it to be able to hear. Alexander tried to protest vehemently, arguing with apparently sound logic that she needed her own adequate rest and that he was completely accustomed to spending nights alone and dealing with his medical conditions independently. But Rosemary was gentle yet inflexibly insistent, explaining with maternal patience that she simply couldn't relax or sleep peacefully knowing that her unwavering determination to care for him during the night clearly came from a deep place of genuine compassion, maternal instinct, and sense of moral responsibility, not from any feeling of obligation created by her financial situation or expectation of material reward or recognition. Rosemary, you really don't need to sacrifice your own comfort, rest, and well-being for my sake. You've already done infinitely more for me than I could ever have hoped, dreamed, or deserved. I don't want you to feel in any way obligated to this, just because I helped you financially in the square. Alexander's intense internal battle intensified dramatically during the silent early hours of the night, as he lay in his luxurious but suddenly less comfortable bed, listening to the soft, comforting sounds of Rosemary occasionally moving in the hallway, discreetly checking on his well-being without disturbing him or invading his privacy, a protective presence he had never experienced before. Decades of psychological conditioning and traumatic experiences persistently warned him against trusting anyone too quickly, especially when significant financial matters and substantial inheritance were at stake. But his direct and prolonged experience with Rosemary so far had been so consistently positive, authentic, and completely selfless that he desperately struggled to find. He mentally reviewed and analyzed every interaction they had had since the moment they met in the square, every specific word she had said, every gesture she had made, every facial expression she had shown, intensively looking for telling signs of falseness, inconsistency, or emotional manipulation, but finding only growing and consistent evidence of genuine kindness, authentic care, The profound and almost cruel irony of the situation was not lost on him. He had spent his entire life constantly surrounded by people who wanted his wealth, power, and influence, developing sophisticated defenses against manipulation and exploitation. But now that he had finally found someone who seemed genuinely disinterested in his material possessions and exclusively focused on, if Rosemary were really an exceptional actress trying to deceive me with an elaborate performance, it would be the most convincing, detailed, and consistent staging I have witnessed in decades of experience with manipulative people. But what if it's not a performance? What if she is simply a genuinely good, pure, and selfless person who entered my life at exactly the right moment when I most need authentic kindness? Around 3 in the morning, when the house was wrapped in complete silence and the darkness was broken only by the soft light that Rosemary had left on in the hallway, Alexander's heart condition began to deteriorate alarmingly and rapidly progressively, initially manifesting as a growing and worrying difficulty breathing that quickly escalated to an intense and penetrating chest pain. He desperately tried to call for help, but his voice came out weak, hoarse, and almost inaudible, barely managing to produce articulated sounds while simultaneously fighting against the growing pain spreading through his chest and arms, the breathing difficulty that was dramatically intensifying with each moment. Rosemary, who had spent the entire night sleeping only superficially in the strategically positioned chair in the hallway, maintaining a state of relaxed alertness that she had developed through years of caring for sick and vulnerable people, woke up instantly upon hearing the first weak sounds of distress coming from Alexander's room. Her highly developed caregiver instincts She immediately ran to the room without hesitation, her bare feet moving silently across the cold floor, and found Alexander visibly struggling to breathe, his face as pale as paper and covered in cold sweat, signs that her vast experience with sick people and medical emergencies helped her instantly recognize as a severe heart attack that required urgent and immediate medical attention. "Alexander, stay calm and try to breathe slowly. I'm here with you now. I will seek medical help immediately, but I promise I won't leave you alone for even a single second during this crisis." The pain that tore through Alexander's chest during the early hours was different from anything he had experienced before, a physical agony that seemed to radiate from the center of his heart to every nerve ending in his body, accompanied by a crushing weight sensation that made each attempt to breathe a desperate battle against an invisible force that seemed determined to suffocate him. His labored breathing and clear signs of intense discomfort as he fought against the growing pain and respiratory difficulty that was intensifying exponentially with each passing second. Rosemary, who had remained on alert throughout the night, immediately jumped from her chair in the hallway when the first sounds of suffering crossed the closed bedroom door, her maternal instincts and experience with medical emergencies causing her to instantly recognize the severity of the situation. She burst into the room without hesitation and found Alexander bent over himself in bed, his hands desperately clutching the fabric of his nightshirt over his chest, as if physically trying to tear away the pain consuming him, while his face had taken on a deathly pallor that made her immediately realize this wasn't just another crisis, but possibly the beginning of the end. "Alexander, hold on, don't leave me now. I'll get help, but I need you to fight with me." Rosemary rushed to the room's telephone with surprising agility for her age, her hands violently trembling while dialing the housekeeper's number, knowing that Catherine knew all of Alexander's medical contacts and could mobilize help much more quickly than she could alone. Catherine answered immediately at the first ring, as if she too had been waiting for something like this, and didn't waste time with unnecessary questions when Rosemary quickly explained the situation in broken phrases loaded with controlled panic. While Catherine took responsibility for contacting Dr. Richardson and organizing emergency medical assistance, Rosemary immediately returned to Alexander's side, positioning herself beside the bed and holding his hands that were ice-cold and damp with cold sweat, trying to transmit some comfort through physical touch while observing his face contorted in pain. She could hear Catherine urgently shouting on the phone in the next room, her words echoing through the mansion's corridors like a desperate alarm breaking the pre-dawn silence, while she tried to keep Alexander conscious and responsive through soft words and gentle touches that dramatically contrasted with the violence of the crisis devastating his body. "Dr. Richardson, it's an emergency. "Mr. Alexander is having a severe heart attack. You need to come immediately with everything necessary." Dr. Richardson arrived at the mansion in less than 20 minutes, accompanied by a small emergency medical team carrying portable equipment and medications that could temporarily stabilize Alexander. But everyone knew from the moment they entered the room and saw his condition that it was an extremely serious situation with a very guarded prognosis. Alexander was semi-conscious, alternating between moments of painful lucidity where he could recognize the people around him and periods of delirium where he mumbled incoherent words while fighting against the pain consuming his chest and the increasing difficulty breathing that made him arch his back in desperate spasms. Dr. Richardson quickly examined Alexander's vital signs, checked his dangerously low blood pressure, monitored his irregular and weak pulse, and performed a basic neurological assessment that confirmed his worst fears about the accelerated progression of heart failure. Rosemary remained beside the bed throughout the medical examination, firmly holding Alexander's hand and whispering words of encouragement and comfort, her tears silently flowing down her face while watching the doctors work with professional efficiency, but with expressions that gradually became more somber as they assessed the situation. "Doctor, please tell me you can do something for him. Alexander is a good man who doesn't deserve to suffer like this." After completing his examination and briefly consulting with other members of the medical team, Dr. Richardson assumed the difficult responsibility of communicating to Rosemary and Catherine the brutal reality of Alexander's medical situation, explaining that his condition had deteriorated far beyond what any available medical intervention could reverse or even stabilize for a significant period. He explained that the medications they were administering could temporarily relieve his pain and ease his breathing, but that the damage to his heart muscle had progressed to an irreversible point where vital organ failure was inevitable and would likely occur within hours, not days. Rosemary heard every word with growing horror and hopelessness, but maintained her composure for Alexander, instinctively knowing that he needed strength and calmness around him, not panic or hysteria that would only increase his psychological suffering during his final moments. Catherine, who had known Alexander for so many years and witnessed both his loneliness and his generosity, remained in the room with silent tears running down her face, offering quiet but meaningful support through her loyal and dedicated presence. Dr. Richardson adjusted the pain medications and administered mild sedatives that would help Alexander find some relief from physical suffering without completely compromising his consciousness, allowing him to have moments of lucidity to say proper goodbyes. Rosemary, fully absorbing the terminal gravity of Alexander's situation, made a firm and unbreakable decision that she would not leave him alone for even a moment during his final hours, demonstrating a loyalty and dedication that surprised even the doctors present, who were accustomed to seeing distant relatives or those only interested in financial matters during moments like this. She positioned a comfortable chair immediately next to Alexander's bed, where she would remain during the coming critical hours, constantly holding his hand and maintaining a soft and comforting conversation that included shared memories of their few but intense hours together, stories from her own life that she knew he had enjoyed hearing, and words of spiritual comfort. Alexander, during his moments of greater lucidity, managed to focus his eyes on Rosemary and gently squeeze her hand in acknowledgement of her presence, a non-verbal communication that spoke volumes about the extraordinary connection that had developed between them in such a short time. Catherine discreetly organized the room to create an environment as peaceful and dignified as possible, adjusting the lighting to a soft and warm glow, ensuring the temperature was comfortable, and removing any unnecessary medical equipment that might create a cold and impersonal hospital atmosphere. "Alexander, don't be afraid, you are not alone. I am here with you and will remain by your side until the end, as true family would do." During the following hours, as Alexander's condition fluctuated between periods of intense pain and moments of relative tranquility provided by the medications, Rosemary demonstrated a kind of love and dedication that he had never experienced in his entire life, not even during his childhood, when he was raised by professional caregivers who, although competent, she softly sang lullabies she had learned from her own mother, simple but deeply comforting melodies that seemed to calm Alexander's tormented spirit even when his body was in agony, creating an atmosphere of spiritual peace that dramatically contrasted with the physical trauma he was experiencing. When he was conscious enough to speak, she gently encouraged him to share any thoughts or feelings he wished to express, offering a compassionate and understanding ear for any regrets, fears, or hopes he wanted to communicate during his final moments. Rosemary also shared with him her own perspective on death as a transition to something greater and more beautiful, not trying to impose her religious beliefs, but offering the spiritual consolation that had sustained her own family through many losses and difficulties over the years. "Alexander, the love we shared in these few hours is real and eternal. This no one can take from you, not even death." In a particularly lucid moment, when the pain had temporarily subsided due to medication, and Alexander could think with relative clarity, he looked directly into Rosemary's eyes and had a profound revelation about the extraordinary nature of what was happening between them, recognizing that this woman, whom he had met just 2 days ago, was demonstrating more genuine love. He reflected on the cruel irony of his situation. He had spent decades seeking meaningful relationships through his wealth and social position, only to discover that true love had come to him when he least expected it, and from a source that had absolutely nothing to gain materially from her devotion. Rosemary wasn't there out of financial interest, didn't expect inheritance or reward, wasn't trying to impress others or build a social reputation. She was there simply because she genuinely cared about him as a human being and couldn't abandon someone who was suffering. Alexander realized that if he had a biological child, based on his experience with human relationships throughout his life, that child would probably be more interested in inheritance matters than in providing emotional comfort during his final moments, while this stranger who had entered his life by chance was offering the kind of unconditional love he had always desired, but never found. "Rosemary, you have shown me in 2 days what true love is, something I've searched for throughout my entire life but never found until now." As the hours passed and Alexander's condition continued to gradually deteriorate, with periods of unconsciousness becoming longer and more frequent, he began making important mental decisions about practical matters that needed to be resolved before he completely lost the ability to communicate clearly. During a particularly clear moment of lucidity, when he managed to speak with a weak but determined voice, Alexander called Rosemary closer and began expressing thoughts he had been formulating during his hours of reflection between pain and medication. He talked about how the experience of meeting her had fundamentally changed his perspective on human values, genuine relationships, and the true meaning of wealth, explaining that she had given him the greatest possible gift, the experience of being loved unconditionally for who he was as a person, not for what he materially possessed. Rosemary listened to every word with focused attention, sometimes having to lean in to hear his increasingly weak voice, but completely absorbing the emotional and spiritual depth of what he was sharing with her during what might be his last moments of conscious communication. Catherine, who had remained discreetly present throughout the vigil, witnessed this extraordinary exchange between two people who barely knew each other, but had found a deeper connection than many decades-long relationships managed to achieve. "Rosemary, you need to know that these 2 days with you have been the most significant of my entire life. You have taught me the true value of human kindness." During another period of lucidity, when Dr. Richardson was checking his vital signs and adjusting medications to maintain his comfort, Alexander demonstrated surprising determination for someone in his condition, insisting that he needed to make an important decision while he still had mental clarity and legal capacity to do so. He explained to Rosemary, Catherine, and the doctor that he had spent the last few hours intensely reflecting on his life, his values, and the legacy he wanted to leave, reaching a definitive conclusion about how he wanted his wealth to be used after his death. Rosemary tried to dissuade him from thinking about practical matters during such difficult moments, encouraging him to focus only on finding peace and comfort, but Alexander insisted that resolving this issue was essential for his spiritual tranquility, and that he couldn't die in peace knowing his fortune would remain without a proper destination. He expressed his absolute conviction that Rosemary was the only person he knew who possessed the moral integrity, practical wisdom, and genuine kindness necessary to use his wealth responsibly and beneficially, not for personal gain, but to help other people in situations similar to what she had faced. Dr. Richardson, although initially reluctant to allow legal matters to complicate Alexander's final moments, recognized that resolving this issue was clearly important to his patient's peace of mind, and that denying this request could cause more emotional distress than consenting to it. "Doctor, I need you to understand that this is not an impulsive decision. It's the most important thing I can do with my life, and I need to do it while I'm still able." Alexander's determination to legally formalize his inheritance decision intensified dramatically when he realized that his time was rapidly running out and that delays could result in his fortune being distributed according to standard legal protocols that would not reflect his true intentions and values. With an increasingly weak voice but still clear in his determination, he urgently requested that Catherine contact his personal lawyer and request the immediate presence of a qualified notary who could supervise the preparation and execution of appropriate legal documents that would ensure Rosemary received her inheritance according to his specific instructions. Rosemary was genuinely shocked and vehemently protested when she understood the implications of what Alexander was proposing, arguing that she did not deserve such generosity and that she did not want him to make such important decisions while under the influence of pain medication and facing extreme emotional trauma. She insisted that her presence and care were not motivated by any expectation of material reward, and that she would be devastated if anyone thought she had manipulated a dying man for financial gain, a concern that demonstrated exactly the kind of moral integrity that had convinced Alexander that she was the right choice for his inheritance. Catherine, who had observed the entire interaction and could testify to the authenticity of both their motivations, offered to make the necessary calls while emphasizing to Rosemary that Alexander's intentions were clearly genuine and based on careful observation of her character, not on impulse or mental confusion. "Rosemary, you saved my soul when you cared for me without expecting anything in return. Now let me do something that will give meaning to all the wealth I've accumulated during my life." The sound of vehicles arriving at the mansion during the early morning hours broke the respectful silence that had settled in the room where Alexander was bravely fighting against death. And Catherine, who was discreetly checking the medications on the side table, immediately ran to the large bedroom window to identify who might be visiting the property at such. Her initial expression of curious surprise quickly transformed into genuine concern, and then into outright hostility when she clearly recognized the familiar figure of Stephen getting out of a luxurious and expensive car, accompanied by a man in an impeccably cut dark suit, who carried an obviously expensive leather briefcase and had all the professional and intimidating appearance. Catherine immediately realized, with the sharp intuition she had developed through years of observing human behavior in the mansion, that Stephen's sudden presence at that specific moment was not an emotional coincidence or a belated filial impulse of concern, but rather the calculated result of some carefully developed plan that would likely involve aggressive legal questioning. She felt a powerful wave of protective and maternal indignation, both for her employer, who was facing his final moments with such dignity and courage, and for Rosemary, who had demonstrated genuine kindness, selfless care, and unwavering loyalty throughout her stay at the mansion, treating Alexander with the kind of love he had never received in his entire lonely life. "I cannot believe that this despicable man has the audacity and lack of decency to show up here now, just when Alexander most needs peace, tranquility, and respect in his final moments." Stephen entered the luxurious mansion with arrogant confidence and a domineering posture that contrasted dramatically with the visible nervousness and insecurity he had displayed in the square when negotiating the sale of his own mother as if she were a disposable object, now clearly feeling empowered and strengthened by the intimidating presence of his expensive lawyer. He wore significantly better and more expensive clothes than he had previously, including a well-tailored suit, Italian leather shoes, and accessories that had clearly been purchased with a substantial portion of the money he had received from Alexander in exchange for his mother's humiliation, a cruel irony that did not go unnoticed by Catherine when she observed him entering. His general behavior demonstrated a repugnant combination of blatant greed, limitless financial ambition, and completely feigned indignation that was so transparent that it made Catherine feel physical disgust and moral revulsion just looking at him and witnessing his flagrant hypocrisy. The lawyer accompanying him was a middle-aged man with meticulously combed-back graying hair, expensive framed glasses that reflected cold light, and an air of calculated professional competence that suggested significant and successful experience in inheritance disputes, undue influence cases, and complex legal matters involving wealthy, vulnerable people in terminal health situations. Stephen addressed Catherine in a condescending and authoritarian manner, as if she were a common employee without rights, opinion, or value as a human being, demanding immediate and unconditional access to Alexander, detailed information about his current medical condition, and any recent legal or financial decisions he might have made, especially those that could benefit his. Catherine, I demand to see my mother immediately and verify exactly what is happening with Alexander and his condition. I have legitimate and well-founded reasons to believe she may be deliberately taking advantage of a sick and vulnerable man for personal financial gain. When Stephen and his lawyer finally gained forced access to the room where Alexander was being cared for, with dedication and affection, the atmosphere of respectful peace, human dignity, and genuine love that Rosemary had carefully created and maintained for hours was immediately and violently replaced by a hostile, aggressive, and legal tension that made the very Rosemary, who was sitting patiently beside the bed in her vigil chair, holding Alexander's fragile hand with maternal care and conversing softly with him during one of his precious moments of lucidity between waves of pain and medication, looked up with genuine innocence and surprise when she heard footsteps approaching, and then with growing horror and disbelief when she realized. Stephen showed no genuine interest, human compassion, or filial concern for Alexander's serious and terminal health condition, nor did he show any sympathy for the delicate medical situation or respect for the palliative care environment that had been established. Instead, his cold, calculating eyes immediately began to meticulously evaluate and catalogue the luxurious room, the expensive medical equipment present, the quality of care being offered, and especially the intimate and caring physical proximity between his mother and the richest dying man in the region, as if systematically collecting evidence for some legal case he was mentally. The lawyer remained strategically discreet near the entrance door, positioning himself to observe everything, with experienced professional eyes trained to detect and interpret situations that could be legally challenged in courts, while making detailed mental notes about the emotional dynamics between those present, any behavior that could be interpreted or distorted as evidence of, "Mother, I need to speak with you immediately and urgently about your questionable situation here, and the very convenient circumstances that led to this suspicious proximity with an extremely wealthy man who is dying and may be vulnerable to emotional manipulation." The direct, cruel, and completely unfair accusation that Stephen made against Rosemary was so shocking in its calculated cruelty and so unjustified in its factual basis that even Dr. Richardson, who was professionally focused on checking Alexander's vital signs and adjusting his pain medications, momentarily stopped his important medical work to look with frank disapproval and professional disbelief at the man who had just entered the palliative care environment as a destructive force, bringing hostility and agitation to a space that should be dedicated to peace. Stephen directly accused his mother, in a loud and clear voice so that everyone present could hear every accusatory word and every harmful insinuation, of having deliberately and calculatingly manipulated Alexander during his extreme medical and emotional vulnerability, cruelly taking advantage of his profound loneliness, his social isolation. He argued with feigned conviction and fabricated indignation that Rosemary, despite her convincing external appearance of natural kindness, genuine simplicity, and authentic humility, had in fact demonstrated a calculated psychological sophistication and subtle emotional manipulation by strategically positioning herself as the only truly caring and dedicated person in Alexander's lonely. Rosemary heard every accusatory word with growing horror, absolute incredulity, and tears of justified indignation and deep emotional pain, completely unable to believe or mentally process that the son she had raised with such unconditional love, extreme personal sacrifice, and maternal dedication over decades could not only publicly sell her as human merchandise, but now also. The experienced lawyer supported and reinforced Stephen's accusatory statements with technical and intimidating legal language, mentioning specific precedents of legal cases where unscrupulous people had been formally accused and legally convicted of exercising undue influence over wealthy and vulnerable individuals during moments of extreme physical, emotional, and mental weakness. Mother, you can try to pretend innocence and simplicity, but it is absolutely clear to any intelligent and observant person that you deliberately manipulated a desperately lonely man, terrified of death, to obtain substantial financial advantages. This is not only morally repugnant and ethically indefensible, but also possibly illegal under laws that protect vulnerable people. Rosemary, with tears of genuine emotional pain flowing freely down her aged face, but still maintaining all her natural dignity and moral integrity intact, rose slowly and carefully from the chair where she had spent countless hours devotedly caring for Alexander without any thought of reward or personal benefit, and directly confronted her son's devastating accusations with a... She spoke with a voice initially trembling due to emotional shock, but gradually becoming clearer and firmer as she found her inner strength, explaining in detail that never, not for a single moment, had she thought about financial matters, inheritance, or material benefits during all the time she had spent dedicatedly caring for Alexander, that her only true and pure motivation had been to... She described in specific and emotionally charged details how she had cared for Alexander, without any expectation of material reward, social recognition, or personal benefit, how she had voluntarily sacrificed her own physical comfort, personal rest, and well-being to ensure that he would not die in the cruel solitude and abandonment that had characterized much of his life, and how each, Catherine, who had personally witnessed and closely observed every interaction between Rosemary and Alexander since the moment she had arrived at the mansion, intervened courageously and vehemently in passionate defense of the elderly woman, describing with specific and convincing details the natural and completely authentic kindness she had observed during days of close... Stephen, how can you have the cruelty and lack of moral decency to accuse your own mother of something so terrible and unfair? She cared for him with pure and selfless love, demonstrating a type of genuine kindness that you clearly cannot understand or recognize. Dr. Richardson found himself in an extremely difficult, ethically complicated, and professionally delicate position, divided between his fundamental medical responsibility to protect the best interests of his terminal patient and his direct personal observation of the genuinely caring, selfless, and beneficial behavior that Rosemary had consistently demonstrated throughout Alexander's serious medical crisis. As an experienced physician with decades of practice and exposure to complex family situations, he had witnessed countless disturbing situations where distant or opportunistic family members suddenly appeared like vultures when significant inheritance issues were at stake, often demonstrating much more obsessive interest in financial and legal matters than in the physical well-being. He had observed Rosemary meticulously during long hours of dedicated care and personal sacrifice, specifically noting that she never, not even once, had mentioned money, inheritance, financial matters, or material benefits, focusing exclusively and consistently on Alexander's immediate physical comfort, emotional well-being, and spiritual peace during his most vulnerable and terrifying moments. However, as a medical professional with rigorous legal and ethical responsibilities, he also had the professional obligation to objectively consider whether Alexander was truly in adequate mental conditions, free from medication influence, and sufficiently clear to make important and irreversible legal decisions, especially considering the potent pain medications he was regularly receiving. The doctor tried consciously to maintain rigorous professional neutrality while observing the legal and emotional dispute unfolding before him, but his personal sympathies clearly were with Rosemary, whose authentic kindness, genuine care, and pure motivations he had directly witnessed and could professionally attest to. As a physician with decades of experience, I can professionally attest that Rosemary has demonstrated genuine, selfless and beneficial care throughout this crisis. However, I must also carefully consider and objectively evaluate my patient's legal and mental capacity to make important and irreversible decisions during a period of extreme physical and emotional trauma. Stephen's experienced lawyer, clearly demonstrating the professional skill and legal experience he had acquired through many years handling similar complex cases involving inheritance disputes, vulnerable wealthy individuals, and undue influence situations, systematically and methodically began building a technical and intimidating legal case against any decision Alexander might have made. He mentioned specific and well-documented cases where superior courts had formally annulled wills, inheritance decisions, and property transfers when there was compelling evidence that the deceased had been unduly influenced by people who directly and substantially benefited from these decisions, especially when these people were strangers or recent acquaintances who had entered the deceased's life only during periods of extreme vulnerability. The lawyer argued persuasively that the current situation presented many of the typical and easily recognizable characteristics of classic cases of exploitation of vulnerable elderly individuals, where unscrupulous individuals calculatedly took advantage of chronic loneliness, terminal illness, and the terrifying proximity of death to gain strategic access to significant fortunes through subtle but extremely effective emotional manipulation techniques. He professionally and convincingly suggested that Rosemary, despite her carefully cultivated external appearance of genuine simplicity and natural kindness, might in reality be much more sophisticated, calculated and experienced in her psychological manipulation tactics than she superficially appeared, using exactly her convincing image of innocence, vulnerability and kindness as, "Doctor, surely as an experienced and respected medical professional, you recognize and understand that terminal patients under heavy medication and facing extreme emotional trauma frequently make impulsive and irrational decisions that they would never make under normal circumstances of physical and mental health. The law exists precisely to protect vulnerable people against this specific type of calculated exploitation and sophisticated emotional manipulation." Rosemary, now facing not only the cruel and unjustified accusations from her own son, who should protect and defend her, but also the systematic and intimidating professional questioning of her moral integrity and personal motivations by an experienced and well-paid lawyer, felt as if she were reliving and re-experiencing the deep humiliation and degradation she had suffered in the... She tried to explain again, with an increasingly weak and trembling voice due to extreme emotional stress, physical exhaustion from caring for Alexander for hours without rest, and psychological trauma from being verbally attacked by her own son, that never, not for a moment during all the time she had spent in the luxurious mansion, had she considered financial matters, inheritance. She desperately begged all those present to carefully consider her personal history of an entire life, dedicated to the honest service of others, her complete lack of historical interest in material wealth or social status, her consistent satisfaction with a simple but dignified life, and the incontestable fact that she had reluctantly and hesitantly accepted even the basic help and temporary. Catherine continued defending Rosemary with growing passion and justified indignation, providing detailed, specific, and convincing testimony about each interaction she had personally observed between Rosemary and Alexander, each gesture of care she had witnessed, each word of comfort she had heard, and directly and vehemently challenging any person present to find concrete. "Please, for all that is sacred and just, try to understand and accept that never, not for a second, did I think about money, inheritance, or material advantages. My only concern was always that he would know he wasn't completely alone in the world, that at least one person genuinely cared about him as a human being and not about his wealth." The emotional and legal tension in the room reached an explosive critical point when Stephen, visibly frustrated by the determined resistance that his calculated accusations were encountering among those present and by the passionate and convincing defense that Catherine was consistently offering her mother, decided to escalate his aggressive tactics and make even more direct. He suggested with malicious conviction and cruel creativity that his mother had deliberately and strategically placed herself in the vulnerable position of being rescued in the public square, possibly even orchestrating and arranging the entire humiliating situation with his unwitting but essential help, calculatingly knowing that a rich, powerful, and notoriously lonely man would naturally. Stephen argued with elaborate details and fabricated convincingness that Rosemary had more practical knowledge and real experience with subtle psychological manipulation techniques than she had ever admitted or revealed, using exactly her carefully cultivated image of innocent victim, defenseless elderly woman, and natural kindness as a strategic and extremely effective tool to gain. The experienced lawyer supported and amplified these even more serious and damaging allegations by suggesting with professional authority that specialized courts had seen and judged similar legal cases where apparently innocent and unsuspected people had in reality orchestrated complex and elaborate situations to strategically place themselves in positions where they could. Rosemary was visibly and deeply disturbed by these even more extreme and unfair accusations, her natural dignity and moral integrity being tested to their absolute limits as she listened to her own son systematically construct an elaborate and convincing narrative that portrayed her as a sophisticated, calculated. "Mother, you've always been smarter, more calculated, and more manipulative than you superficially appeared to the world. Frankly, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to discover that you meticulously planned this entire situation from the beginning, with the specific goal of financially taking advantage of an extremely rich, desperately lonely man who was vulnerable to emotional manipulation." At this critical and explosive moment of devastating accusations and passionate counter-accusations, when the atmosphere in the room had become so tense, hostile, and charged with injustice that even the air seemed physically heavy and electrically charged with hostility and legal threats, Alexander, who had been alternating between lucid awareness and medicated unconsciousness, his words cut through the cacophonous chaos of argumentative voices like a sharp and precise blade, immediately and unequivocally commanding the respectful attention of everyone present and conclusively demonstrating that, despite his severely deteriorated physical condition and obvious proximity to death, his mind remained completely lucid, his judgment capacity was intact. He looked directly at Stephen with an expression of absolute disgust, moral repugnance and incontestable authority that made the younger, greedy man instinctively and visibly recoil, and then directed his penetrating gaze at the expensive lawyer with all the natural authority and commanding presence of someone. Alexander declared with each word carefully chosen and pronounced with the utmost clarity possible, given his deteriorated physical condition, that his decision to benefit Rosemary with his inheritance was completely conscious, totally voluntary, based on direct and careful observation of her exceptional character. He directly and unequivocally challenged anyone present to question his mental capacity, suggest that he was being manipulated or insinuate that he was not in full control of his faculties, explaining with absolute authority that he had made business decisions involving millions of dollars throughout his successful. "My decision is absolutely conscious, completely voluntary, and morally unquestionable. Rosemary deserves my eternal gratitude and complete trust more than anyone I have known in my entire life. Now I demand that a qualified notary be brought immediately so that I can legally formalize this decision before it is too late, and my opportunity to do justice is lost forever." The official notary arrived at the mansion within 45 minutes after Catherine's urgent call. A middle-aged man with impeccable professional appearance and a leather portfolio containing all the necessary documents and legal instruments to formalize wills and inheritance decisions, even in circumstances as dramatic and emotionally charged as that one. He presented himself respectfully, had more than 20 years of experience dealing with delicate situations involving terminally ill people, having developed throughout his career a special ability to quickly assess the mental and legal capacity of individuals in serious medical conditions, distinguishing between. When he entered the room where Alexander rested, surrounded by the palpable tension between Rosemary, Stephen, his lawyer, and the medical professionals present, the notary immediately took control of the situation with the calm and respectful authority that his position required, explaining that he would conduct He requested a few minutes of privacy to speak directly with Alexander, asking specific questions about his identity, current date, understanding of his medical condition, and complete understanding of the implications of his decisions, a process that all those present observed with intense attention, especially Stephen. "Mr. Alexander, I need to verify your legal capacity to make this decision. Can you confirm that you fully understand the implications of what you are about to do?" Alexander, gathering his remaining strength with a determination that surprised even Dr. Richardson, answered each of the notary's questions with impressive mental clarity and careful articulation, unequivocally demonstrating that, despite his severely deteriorated physical condition, his mind remained lucid, his memory was intact, and his capacity for logical reasoning continued to function perfectly. He explained in detail his terminal medical situation, acknowledged the proximity of his death, identified each person present in the room, and described the specific and well-founded reasons why he wished to leave his fortune to Rose Mary, including observations about her exceptional character, selfless care, and the notary took meticulous notes throughout the assessment, occasionally asking follow-up questions to confirm the consistency and coherence of Alexander's responses, while Stephen and his lawyer watched with growing frustration and despair, realizing that their hopes of questioning Alexander's mental capacity were rapidly fading in the face of clear evidence of his mental lucidity. Rose Mary remained silently by the bed, holding Alexander's hand to give him emotional strength during the legal process, her tears flowing constantly, not only from the sadness of seeing him suffering, but also from the overwhelming emotion of witnessing an act of generosity and trust that surpassed anything she could have imagined in her most optimistic circumstances. "Mr. Alexander, based on my professional assessment, I confirm that you are in full mental faculties to make this decision. We can proceed with the formalization of the will." The preparation of legal documents was a meticulous process that took approximately an hour, during which the notary worked carefully to ensure that every aspect of Alexander's wishes was recorded with absolute legal accuracy, including detailed specifications about the distribution of his fortune, properties, investments, and personal possessions. Alexander insisted on leaving most of his substantial wealth to Rose Mary, including the mansion where they were, his main bank accounts, diversified investment portfolio, and various commercial properties that generated significant passive income. But he also made sure to include generous provisions for Catherine, recognizing her loyalty and dedicated service over the years. Throughout the legal preparation process, Stephen and his lawyer remained in the room as hostile observers, occasionally trying to interrupt or question specific aspects of the will, but being consistently rebutted by the notary, who maintained absolute professional control over the procedure and did not allow external interference that could compromise the legal validity of the document. Rose Mary tried several times to protest against Alexander's extreme generosity, arguing that she did not deserve such wealth and that a small amount would be more than enough for her simple needs. But Alexander firmly insisted that his decision was final and based on absolute conviction about her character and her ability to use wealth responsibly and beneficially. "Rose Mary, you gave me something money cannot buy, dignity and love in my final days. Now let me repay you in the only way I can." The moment of the final signature was intensely emotional and loaded with profound meaning for everyone present, with Alexander using his last reserves of physical strength to hold the pen with trembling but determined hands, his signature emerging slowly but clearly on the official paper that would legally seal the fate of his fortune. The notary carefully supervised every aspect of the process, ensuring that the signature was made voluntarily, without external coercion and with full understanding of the implications, while official witnesses, including Dr. Richardson and Catherine, added their own signatures to legally validate the document and protect it against future challenges. Rose Mary observed the entire process with a mixture of overwhelming gratitude, intimidating responsibility, and deep sadness, knowing that each stroke of Alexander's pen not only drastically changed her financial future, but also represented a final act of trust and love from an extraordinary man who had entered her life in such an unexpected and transformative way. Stephen watched the signing with growing anger and palpable frustration, realizing that all his plans to question the validity of Alexander's decisions were being systematically destroyed by the notary's legal competence and the unequivocal mental clarity demonstrated by Alexander throughout the process. When the last signature was completed and the document was officially sealed and registered, the silence that followed was broken only by the sounds of Alexander's labored breathing and Rosemary's soft sobs, who finally fully understood the magnitude of the transformation that had just occurred in her life. "It is done, Rosemary. My fortune is now yours, and I have absolute confidence that you will use it to honor the memory of the good man I met through your care." A few minutes after the conclusion of the legal formalization, Alexander experienced a sense of profound peace and completeness that had been absent from his life for decades, knowing that he had finally found a true purpose for his wealth and that his legacy would be continued by someone whose character and values would ensure that his fortune would be used to do good in the world. He used his last moments of consciousness to express gratitude to Rosemary for bringing love and meaning to his final days, to thank Catherine for her unwavering loyalty over the years, and to forgive even Stephen, recognizing that greed and selfishness were forms of suffering that he hoped the man might eventually overcome. Rosemary remained by Alexander's side, holding his hand with maternal affection and whispering words of consolation and gratitude, promising that she would honor his memory not only through the responsible use of her inheritance, but also by keeping the memory of his kindness and generosity alive through acts of charity and service to those in need. As his breathing became weaker and irregular, Alexander looked one last time into Rosemary's kind eyes, finding in them confirmation that he had made the right decision and that his legacy would be in safe and morally upright hands. His last words were an almost inaudible whisper of gratitude and peace, before his hand gently relaxed in Rosemary's and his breathing ceased completely, leaving a respectful silence that was broken only by the tears of all present, except Stephen, who remained visibly frustrated with the final outcome. "Rosemary, you taught me that true wealth lies in the love we give and receive. Promise me you'll continue to spread this wealth throughout the world." After officially confirming Alexander's death, Dr. Richardson conducted the necessary medical procedures with dignity and respect, while the notary completed all the legal documentation required to officially validate the will and begin the property transfer process. Stephen's lawyer, although clearly reluctant and visibly frustrated with the outcome, was forced to professionally confirm the absolute legality of the will, recognizing that all procedures had been correctly followed, that Alexander had demonstrated unquestionable mental capacity throughout the process, and that there were no legal grounds to contest the validity of the recorded decisions. This legal confirmation represented a humiliating defeat for Stephen, who had invested time, money, and hopes in the possibility of challenging the inheritance and possibly claiming a portion of Alexander's fortune for himself, based on some fabricated family connection or questioning of the deceased's mental competence. Rosemary, even amidst the deep sadness over Alexander's loss, found herself in the surreal and intimidating position of suddenly being one of the wealthiest women in the region, a transformation she had neither sought nor desired, but which now represented an enormous responsibility that she was determined to honor properly. Catherine offered emotional and practical support to Rosemary during this difficult transition period, promising to help her navigate the complexities of wealth management and ensure that Alexander's intentions were faithfully fulfilled. Ms. Rosemary, as the official legal representative, I confirm that the inheritance is legally yours. Mr. Alexander made this decision consciously, and it cannot be contested. Stephen, confronted with the inescapable reality that his mother had become the legitimate heir to a fortune he had dreamed of obtaining for himself, experienced a toxic mixture of anger, envy, humiliation, and regret that left him visibly disturbed and emotionally unstable. He had wasted not only the opportunity to have a genuine relationship with his mother, but also any chance of benefiting from Alexander's generosity through respectful and decent behavior, having chosen instead the path of greed, manipulation, and cruelty that now left him completely isolated and without resources. His anger manifested in final, desperate accusations against Rosemary, suggesting that she had somehow orchestrated the entire situation from the beginning. But these allegations sounded empty and pathetic in the face of clear evidence of his own culpability in selling out his mother and trying to exploit the situation for personal gain. Rosemary, even after witnessing her son's cruel transformation and experiencing his betrayal and hostility, still demonstrated maternal compassion and offered forgiveness, explaining that the door would always be open for genuine reconciliation if he chose to change his behavior and values, but that she would no longer tolerate attempts at manipulation or exploitation. Catherine and Dr. Richardson served as witnesses to the dignity with which Rosemary handled Stephen's hostility, demonstrating exactly the kind of character and integrity that had convinced Alexander that she was the right person to inherit his fortune. "Stephen, even after everything you've done, you are still my son and will always have my love, but I will no longer tolerate your attempts to use or manipulate me for personal gain." In the days following Alexander's death and the formalization of the inheritance, Rosemary demonstrated exactly why Alexander had chosen to entrust his fortune to her, immediately beginning to make detailed plans to use the wealth responsibly and beneficially, focusing especially on helping people in situations similar to what she had faced before meeting Alexander. She worked closely with Catherine and respectable financial consultants to establish charitable foundations, assistance programs for abandoned elderly, shelters for people without resources, and educational initiatives that would honor Alexander's memory while making a tangible difference in the lives of people in need. Rosemary also insisted on keeping the mansion exactly as Alexander had left it, preserving his personal items, library, and office as a kind of memorial to his life and achievements, while using other parts of the property to host charity events and meetings of benevolent organizations. Her careful and respectful approach to managing the inheritance impressed even experienced wealth management professionals, who recognized in her a rare combination of humility, practical wisdom, and moral determination that would ensure the proper use of the substantial resources she had inherited. Stephen, observing his mother's actions from afar, gradually began to realize the magnitude of his own loss, not only in financial terms, but also in terms of the relationship he had destroyed with a truly exceptional woman who was now using her new position to do good in the world. Alexander chose the right person to continue his legacy. Rosemary is transforming material wealth into blessings for people who really need it. A few weeks after Alexander's death, while Rosemary carefully organized personal documents and objects in the private office of the mansion, preparing to donate many of the books to public libraries and preserve other items of sentimental value as a reminder of the extraordinary man who had changed her life, she discovered a secret drawer in his antique noble wooden desk that contained personal documents that Alexander had apparently kept in absolute privacy throughout his life. Among birth certificates, old photographs, and personal correspondence, Rosemary found a sealed letter with her name written in Alexander's characteristic handwriting, accompanied by documents that revealed surprising details about his past that she had never imagined, and that extraordinarily explained why he had connected so deeply and instantly with her from the moment they met in the square. The letter, apparently written during one of his final nights while she cared for him, revealed that Alexander had spent decades searching for information about his biological family, having been adopted as a baby and raised by parents who never revealed details about his true origins, and that recent research had indicated a possible family connection that he had been discreetly investigating. The documents included certificates, genealogical records, and correspondence with private investigators, suggesting a family connection between Alexander and Rosemary that went back several generations, a discovery that had left Alexander emotionally shaken, but also deeply grateful for having found Rosemary before dying, even though he hadn't had the courage to reveal this information directly to her during his last days. "My dear Rosemary, if you are reading this letter, it means you have found the documents that reveal our family connection. You not only cared for me as a kind stranger, but as the true family I searched for throughout my life." Rosemary sat down slowly in the leather chair that had been Alexander's, her hands trembling as she held the sealed letter bearing her name written in the careful handwriting she had learned to recognize during his final days. The office was silent except for the soft ticking of the antique clock on the wall, and the golden late afternoon light filtered through the heavy curtains, creating a solemn and respectful atmosphere that seemed appropriate for the moment of revelation she was about to experience. She had spent weeks organizing Alexander's personal belongings with reverential care, preserving each object as a precious reminder of the extraordinary man who had transformed her life in such an unexpected and profound way, but always feeling there was something unsaid, some mystery behind the instantaneous and inexplicable connection that had emerged between them from the first moment. Now holding that letter that clearly contained important secrets that Alexander had kept throughout his life, Rosemary felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension, instinctively knowing that what she was about to discover would forever change her understanding of the extraordinary events that had occurred. "Alexander, even after your departure, you continue to surprise me. What secrets have you kept for so long?" With careful and respectful fingers, Rosemary broke the seal of the letter, revealing several handwritten pages in Alexander's familiar handwriting, accompanied by old photographs yellowed by time and official documents that seemed to date back decades. The first page of the letter began with an affectionate greeting that immediately brought tears to her eyes, as she could almost hear his voice pronouncing the words he had written during one of his last nights, when she thought he was resting but was actually preparing this final revelation. Alexander explained that he had begun writing that letter after discovering information he had sought throughout his adult life, information that gave a completely new meaning to their seemingly casual meeting in the square and the deep connection that had instantly emerged between two people who should have been complete strangers. He described how he had been adopted as a baby by a wealthy family who had never revealed details about his true origins, creating a void in his identity that had haunted him for decades and motivated him to hire private investigators to discover his real family history. "My dear Rosemary, if you are reading these words, it means you have found the courage to open this last gift I prepared for you, a truth that explains why our meeting was much more than coincidence." As Rosemary continued reading, her surprise and emotion grew exponentially as Alexander revealed that recent genealogical research had indicated a family connection between them dating back 3 generations, when his great-grandfather had been the brother of Rosemary's great-grandfather, members of a humble family that had been separated by difficult economic circumstances during a time of great social instability and widespread poverty. The documents attached to the letter included old birth certificates, baptismal records from a small rural church, and correspondence with investigators specializing in genealogy who had meticulously traced the family lineages through decades of fragmented records and oral histories preserved for generations. Alexander explained that he had discovered this information only a few weeks before meeting her in the square, becoming emotionally devastated upon realizing that he had true family in the world, but also terrified by the possibility of rejection or disbelief if he abruptly revealed a family connection she had no reason to believe or accept. He described how he had struggled during his last days with the dilemma of whether or not to reveal this information, fearing it might seem like a desperate attempt at emotional manipulation or that it might diminish the purity of the genuine connection that had emerged between them based on character and mutual care, not family obligations. "Rosemary, you were not just a kind stranger who took care of me, but the true family I searched for throughout my life without ever knowing you existed so close to me." Tears flowed freely down Rosemary's face as she absorbed the magnitude of the revelation, finally understanding why she had felt such a natural and maternal connection with Alexander from the first moment. An inexplicable familiarity that went beyond gratitude or sympathy and seemed to emerge from somewhere deep in her soul that she couldn't identify at the time. She carefully examined the old photographs that Alexander had included, recognizing with growing surprise familiar traits in faces she had never seen before, but that seemed strangely familiar, especially a photograph of a young man who had the same kind eyes she had always admired in Alexander. Rosemary remembered stories her own grandmother had told about lost family, siblings separated during difficult times, and relatives who had disappeared without a trace, stories she had always considered sad but too ancient to have relevance in her current life. Now holding concrete evidence that these family stories had real connections to her present life, she felt as if pieces of a complex puzzle were finally fitting together to reveal a larger and more meaningful picture than she had ever imagined possible. The letter continued with Alexander explaining that the discovery of this family connection had given a completely new meaning to his decision to leave his fortune to her, transforming what might have seemed an impulsive gesture of gratitude into an act of family justice and continuity of lineage that had been interrupted by historical circumstances. Rosemary, our family was separated by poverty generations ago, but fate brought us together so that I could return to our lineage the prosperity that should have remained with us. The final part of the letter revealed Alexander's deepest feelings about the discovery of this family connection and how it had transformed his final days from a period of loneliness and despair into an experience of completeness and peace he had never imagined possible. He wrote about how he had spent entire nights watching Rosemary care for him, seeing in her not just individual kindness, but character traits and values that had clearly been passed down through generations of their common family, a moral and spiritual heritage that had survived decades of separation and hardship. Alexander explained that he had chosen not to reveal this information during his last days because he wanted absolute certainty that the care and love Rosemary demonstrated were genuine and not influenced by family expectations or kinship obligations, preferring to die knowing he had experienced true love based on pure character. He expressed profound gratitude for having had the opportunity to know and be cared for by someone from his own family, even if briefly, and his conviction that leaving his fortune to Rosemary was not just an act of generosity, but a way to restore historical justice and ensure that wealth remained within the family lineage, where it should have always been. The letter ended with an affectionate blessing and a request for Rosemary to use not only her material inheritance, but also the knowledge of her family connection as sources of strength and purpose in her new life. Now you know that you have not just inherited wealth from a grateful stranger, but reclaimed the family legacy that our lineage lost generations ago. Use both to honor our family and help others as we have been helped. Rosemary remained seated in silence for a long time after finishing reading the letter, holding the pages against her chest while emotionally processing the complete transformation of her understanding about recent events and her own identity. The revelation explained so many things that had seemed mysterious or inexplicable. The instant connection she had felt with Alexander, the naturalness with which she had assumed a maternal role in his care, the sense of familiarity she had experienced in the mansion, and even the ease with which he had entrusted his fortune to her. She understood that what had seemed an extraordinary sequence of coincidences was actually the unfolding of a family destiny that had been dormant for generations, waiting for the right moment to manifest itself and restore connections that should never have been lost. Rosemary felt a profound sense of completeness and purpose, now knowing that her new position as Alexander's heir was not just a generous gift from a stranger, but a restoration of family rights and an opportunity to honor the memory of ancestors who had faced hardships to keep alive the lineage of which she and Alexander were the last known representatives. She thought of her own mother and grandmother, imagining how moved they would be to know that the lost family had been found and that prosperity had finally returned to their lineage through paths they could never have imagined. Alexander, now I understand why we connected so deeply. We weren't strangers who met by chance, but family that fate brought together to heal old wounds and restore lost blessings. Now tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. See you there.